Sorry, just a second. Okay. Hi, I'm David Anderson. I'm a student with part of Honors Mentor Connection. In the audience today, we have one of my teachers, Mrs. Layden. We also have my assistant, we also have Professor Myers, who was my mentor. He's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. And then we also have a school board member, Mrs. Andrea Keene, here today. So my project is focused on media conglomerates and political conflict, assessing the effects of corporate ownership structure on the extent of polarization in local and national newspaper media. So to provide some context for my presentation, we can look at political polarization in the US as starting around the beginning of the information era. So this would be the rise of mass media in the 1970s, and it's still increasing so far today. We also know that the origins of political polarization are somewhat unknown. However, media is suspected to be one of the origins or the major origin, as shown in Iyengar et al. We also know that there's been an increase in polarization between congressional members, as documented on a website called VoteView that's run by UCLA and a few other professors. And essentially what it does is it uses a mathematical equation to gauge the ideology of every single person in every single Congress ever, so every representative. So on the bottom left, we see the 96th Congress, House of Representatives. So this would be from 1979 to 1981. And we can see in this picture that sometimes Democrats were more right than Republicans, and sometimes Republicans were more left than some Democrats. So we can see here that generally there was a mix between the groups. However, this was roughly 10 years before polarization was first being documented within political polarization studies. On the other graph on the bottom right, we can see the 114th Congress, House of Representatives from 2015 to 2017. And we can see that generally this glob that we had on the bottom left is no longer there. It's now become two solidish spheres that show that generally ideology-wise, two groups have formed and there's not been any sort of mixing since then. So in order to assess my research question, I first wanted to look at the gaps I would like to address in my research. So I was informed by Professor Myers, as well as other previous research I conducted for annotated bibliographies, that generally most studies had focused on national newspapers rather than local newspapers in their studies, which meant that there was definitely a gap for local news in my terms of how I could study it. I also knew that corporate ownership structure was not something that was frequently documented in other studies, so I knew that by combining these two, I could address a gap in the research itself. So essentially, I came up with the question, to what extent does corporate ownership structure affect polarization in national and local newspaper media? My hypothesis before starting this project focused on that national news will be more polarized than local news, which has been documented in multiple other studies. And I also assumed that the larger the collective ownership of local newspapers based on ownership structure, the more polarizing the newspapers will be. And this is based on the idea that the more connected these newspapers are to a singular structure, the more national these newspapers will have to be, which in turn means they will be more polarizing than their isolated counterparts. So to provide some background information, so right in the beginning of my study, I looked at a study that showed that ideology and polarization are linked. So essentially, this is a book titled Polarized America, The Dance of Ideology and Unequal Riches, written by McCarty, Poole, and Rosenthal. And this study essentially is the backbone of VoteView, as well as this study itself. And then I also looked at consolidation of local media post-2008. So essentially during the Great Recession, multiple local newspapers unfortunately couldn't survive. So they were either bought up by larger newspapers or they wiped out completely and became a sort of news desert. So through this news desert, more people were focused on national news and there was less local news. So essentially by combining these two, I was able to show that I was able to gather some background information on local media and how it has sort of dwindled over the past few years. I also have here the website for VoteView. So here we can see for the 114th Congress, which is the Congress I was studying, as well as the 115th, we can see that generally, again, we have these two separate groups. And then for the 115th Congress, we can also see that these groups are somewhat a little more broadened, but not entirely. So for my research and inquiry process, my main question was, how would I measure local media polarization? So as I explained before, I decided to use congressional representative ideology to assess polarization. This was based on the Polarized America book, and essentially the theory that was proven in this, that the more often a polarizing member is mentioned, the more likely a newspaper will be polarizing due to this mentioning of the polarizing member. So my next step after this was to collect a local news data set as well as ownership variables. And one of the documents that Professor Myers was able to give me was a document from a study for Hayes and Lawless, which essentially had a list of the most popular newspaper in every congressional district in the United States. So on the bottom left corner, we can see the Hayes and Lawless data, which essentially gave us, it gave us the most popular newspaper for every single congressional district, although it was a little outdated. So for some and a few other records, I had to look through counties within congressional districts using circulation records from examples of, or from websites such as Agility PR Solutions, which offered counts on circulation to show the most popular newspaper in a congressional district. Or I could also look at the most populous city in the district and base my guess off of that to show that this was the most popular local newspaper. I could also use Wikipedia and newspaper about pages to find the years the newspaper has been active. So as you can see in the other graph down below the about word, we can see on the far left the publisher ID, which was mainly used to avoid mixing up the papers during the analyzation. The next row, we can see the congressional district. Then the row after that, we can see the newspaper itself. So for this instance, this would be Texas because all of these come from Texas. And then we can also see the newspapers and how long they have been present. And then on the far right, we can see the newspaper ownership itself. So in my collection of ownership data for local pages, as I explained before, I was mainly able to collect my data from about pages of websites and Wikipedia for ownership history in the subsections of the newspapers. When I couldn't specifically find something about the ownership history, who specifically owned the paper in 2018, which was the set date I decided on for counting ownership, I would check it against past news articles in the case of recent ownership changes. So for instance, some articles would have titles from their own newspaper or from other newspapers in the local area showing a change in ownership. My next step was to create corporate ownership values. So I decided these based on three major groups: private, publicly traded, and investment group, and then I combined two other groups. So a private group was essentially any group that was owned by just a small amount of people. So typically this would be a family-owned newspaper. Then I had publicly traded groups. So this would be any type of news organization that was on the stock market essentially and was open for public trading. Then I also had investment groups. So this was based on percentage investment by a group of people or a community in the newspaper, and that dictated what share they had in the control of the newspaper. Then I had private investment group, which was a combination between the family style and the investment group, and publicly traded, which was a combination between a publicly traded newspaper and an investment group. After this, I would divide them into chains and small establishments in order to get a more clear set of data. So a chain would be counted as 3 or more newspapers owned by a single company, and a small establishment as 2 or less. So at the conclusion of creating these ownership values, I had 10 separate, I guess, X variables for my data. I also, as I said before, was able to find much of this on about pages, the stock market, and then I didn't mention this, company profile websites. So for instance, Dun & Bradstreet had quite a few things on information for where I could find specific data on how the company itself was set up, if it was privately owned, an investment group, publicly traded, and then others. So then in order to account for this data, I would use ones and zeros to show whether this was a yes or a no, or present or not present. So essentially, if you can see advanced publications at the very top, we can see that it is privately owned, but it is not an investment group. It's not publicly traded. It is a chain newspaper, but it is not a small establishment, with the one, of course, being present and the zero not present. So I did this for every single newspaper in order to collect a full complete set of data. After this, I had to synthesize my collection of data. So this was all combined into one chart over the course of 3 to 4 months, and then it was run through archives collected by assistant staff members at the University of Minnesota from a website called newspapers.com, and these archives were used to count for mentions of the congressional members for each article in the scanning software that was used to count these members' names. The results were then also counted nationally for the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post. Then Congress members in the newspapers as well were labeled moderate or polarizing based on a vote view standing. The vote view equation is based on a scale of -1 to 1, with -1 being extreme left and 1 being extreme right. So for moderate, I had anybody in between -0.5 and 0.5, and for polarizing members, anybody less than -0.5 and more than 0.5. Then these mentions were divided based on polarization, ownership structure, and local versus national counts in order to create 4 separate sets of data and to make sure that none of the factors got combined together. Then the averages were taken of each category in order to ensure that it was a more accurate set of data and didn't just reflect how many I had in my data set. Then I created the bar graphs to get a visual representation of the data to show that my numerical results were also correct. So for my results, I found that locally, publicly traded small establishments and publicly traded investment group chains were much more polarizing than any other group. I also found that chains were more polarizing than local, which backed my original hypothesis, assuming that the more connected a newspaper is to other organizations, the more likely they are to be towards a more national level and therefore more polarizing. we also found that the USA Today was the most polarizing national paper, with the New York Times coming in a close second and Washington Post just underneath as well. So my results back the original hypothesis that the national was more polarized than the local, and that the larger the ownership structure, the more polarizing the newspaper was. So here is a data set for my local news on corporate ownership values. And this is a combination of chains and small establishments. So you can see here that, again, publicly traded investment group chains and publicly traded small establishments have roughly the exact same amount of moderate to polarizing members, or moderate to polarizing mentions. And something interesting to note would be that the private chain, for whatever reason, did not actually have any mentions of polarizing members, as well as the private small establishment. So this would be my graph based on national news. So we can see that the USA Today and the New York Times are roughly the exact same in the amount of mentions they had. And generally the Washington Post is as well right behind in terms of ratios. We can also see here, based on chains and local establishments for the graph here, that generally local establishments were more factually reporting, although it was relatively close. However, we can still see that chains are more often than not more polarizing than the local establishments by ratio. Finally, this is just a complete graph of corporate ownership values themselves. So this combines the chains and the small establishments. And this shows that on average, publicly traded investment groups tended to have the most polarizing content out of any other corporate ownership value available to us. So the implications for my project, largely the parties that would be interested for this would be the United States government, United States political science researchers, or anybody studying US political science, and US media organizations. This is mainly on the basis that these could be used to provide further insight on polarization, and specifically whether or not this is a dependent factor or an independent factor to assess whether or not these implications could lead to greater understanding within the field. So specifically, the US government may use this to understand more about the political science realm and the media realm, because polarization has become a much more invested topic. And US media organizations could also use this largely for coverage based, but also to improve their practices to ensure that they're reducing polarization and they're not playing a part in it. And then of course, for political science researchers, this would be based on further research within the field to assess more about the data. So the limits to conclusions and restrictions. Generally, I actually had a relatively small sample size due to the fact that I had a relatively small amount of local newspapers because the archives did not actually find every single newspaper. However, these newspapers were proportionally representative of the US newspaper industry currently. So so essentially from this, we can see that although the sample size was small, it still is relatively proportionate, though a broader sample size should be used in future studies. We can also see that after my study, when I created it, the two largest local media owning chains combined in 2019. So the data that I collected in my study could be somewhat different under new circumstances, given that Gannett and Gatehouse Media combined into one chain, and they now own the vast majority of local newspapers in the United States. We can also see that there was a relatively simple statistical analysis to use, just based on the fact that I did not have a very well or complete understanding of statistics before I began this project. And I actually had to take a statistics course roughly a few months ago in order to analyze my data. So generally, I would suggest for future studies that more factors be analyzed using more sophisticated methods than simple bar charts in order to ensure that what I found was not simply a dependent factor and that it is actually an independent factor and it is not actually causing the polarization. Questions?
Nicely done, David. I do have a couple of questions for you. So you've had a chance to prepare for these oral defense questions. So I'll ask you one from each of the categories that you are aware of the research process, your depth of understanding, and the reflection on the inquiry process. So my first question for you is, how did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact the research process itself?
So generally when I was choosing my research method, most of the choices I made were based on other studies done by political scientists as well as advice from my mentor. So generally my studies were impacted more in a positive way in order to create essentially a more robust study and something that would be a little more above novice, and at least in my hopes, in order to show a more accurate representation of what political science research may look like. So in terms of impacting my results, I believe they probably impacted them to be a little more accurate than they could have been if I had not chosen those specifically.
Thank you. You already touched on this, but I'm curious if you have some more you can say about how your findings can provide direction for future research in the field. Like, what would be that next step, or tell me more about that?
Right. So personally, I think the next step would be to do more statistical analysis on my findings, because given the fact that I was not able to do a more advanced set of statistical analysis on the findings due to my experience, I believe that more could be found from my initial data. So by doing that, maybe it can be proven whether or not corporate ownership is an independent or a dependent factor in political polarization in local media.
All right, and then tell me about how you handled uncertainty in the research process.
Right. So generally for handling uncertainty in the research process, as I explained a little bit before, I would double check it with other articles specifically for data gathering to ensure that when I found something, for instance, on Wikipedia, which is a website that sometimes has some concerns surrounding the validity of it, I would use other articles and the about pages of newspapers to double check that Wikipedia was actually correct and to ensure that all my data was accurate in its gatherings.
Great, that sums up the oral defense questions that I have for you, David. Nice job. I'm gonna stop the recording.